A very good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to the ThinkForest webinar, Science Insights to the European Green Deal and Forests, facilitated by European Forest Institute. My name is Marc. I'll be hosting this webinar here from Helsinki and will be backed up by our technical experts, Pinja, Essi, and Merle, in case the gods of tech aren't fully cooperating with us today. Just as the title of today's webinar promises, you'll be hearing insights on the effects and implications of the European Green Deal to the different aspects of forestry, biodiversity, bioeconomy, and the entire forest-based sector. The speakers and panelists here today represent the most experienced and renowned experts and thought leaders in the field. By the way, the entire webinar will be recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing anything. And if you'll be sharing on Twitter or any other social network, it would be nice if you could use the hashtag ThinkForest. Before we take a quick look at today's program, let's make sure that you can all see the title screen and hear my voice. On the bottom of the screen, you'll find the icons that you can use, the functions that you can use to participate actively during the webinar. And let's start by clicking the raised hand icon there in the bottom, in the middle. So if everybody can click it right now. Yes, looks like you're all on board. Hundreds of hands raised already. Excellent. If you should have any technical issues and you need any technical support during the webinar, simply click on the chat icon. That's one on the left beside the raised hand icon. And after that, you can just simply write your question or comment on the chat box. And our tech experts, Pinja, Essi, and Merle will help you out. So if you have any kind of problems, click on the chat icon and just write what your issue and problem is, and they'll help you out. By the way, if you're participating from a mobile device like a tablet, iPad, mobile phone, iPhone, what have you, you just have to click first the participants, and after that, click on the chat icon. Okay, let's take a look at today's program. After the welcoming words from Marc, the director of the European Forest Institute, and Janez Potočnik, the current ThinkForest president, will be running a live poll to get your opinion on two interesting questions regarding the Green Deal and our topics here today. We'll be running another poll close to the end of the webinar after the panel discussion. So a big thank you to already in advance for your valuable opinions. Appreciate them very much. Our first presentation today will be given by Gert-Jan Nabuurs from Wageningen University on climate smart forestry and the Green Deal. After that, Jürgen Bauhus from the University of Freiburg will be talking about forest biodiversity and the Green Deal. He'll be followed by Lauri Hetemäki from the European Forest Institute, who'll be giving a presentation on bioeconomy and the Green Deal. After each presentation, there'll be a short Q&A slot, about 5 minutes, for your written questions to the presenter. And this is how it works. During the presentation, you can click on the Q&A icon on the bottom of the screen and enter your written question in the provided space. I'll be selecting and presenting your questions to the speakers after each speech, but within the 5-minute time limit. So unfortunately, we won't be having time for all of your questions at this point. After the speakers and the keynotes, we'll be doing a panel discussion under the title of Strengthening Forest-Based Sectors' Contribution to Green Deal. The discussion will be moderated by Toppinen from the University of Helsinki. And the panelists discussing our topic today are Jürgen Bauhus from the University of Freiburg, Gert-Jan Nabuurs from Wageningen University, Fanny-Pomme Langue from the Confederation of European Forest Owners, Stefan Sundman from UPM, and Chantal from the International Union for Conservation of Nature. After the panel, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions or make comments with your own voice. This happens by clicking the raised hand icon and then waiting for the permission from me to use your microphone, but I'll get back to those details once we get there in a couple of hours. Our webinar today ends with the concluding remarks by ThinkForest President Janez Potočnik. And now it's time for the opening words by the Director of the European Forest Institute, Marc, and ThinkForest President Janez Potočnik. Marc Palahí has been responsible for leading the European Forest Institute towards an acknowledged pan-European science policy platform, and he was also instrumental in launching ThinkForest. In addition to being the current ThinkForest president, Janez Potočnik is co-chair of the International Resource Panel hosted by UNEP, chairman of the Forum for the Future of Agriculture and RISE Foundation, and a member of the European Policy Center's Advisory Council. Marc Palahí, Janez Potočnik, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Marcus. President of ThinkForest, Mr. Janez Potočnik, dear panelists, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to our ThinkForest event. An event that aims at having an informed discussion on the role of forest, forestry, and forest-based solutions to realize the ambitions of the Green Deal. So let me start by sharing a few reflections on the Green Deal. In my opinion, the EU Green Deal can become the most important political initiative of the last decades, because Europe urgently needs a strategy to relaunch the economy after the current crisis. And the Green Deal should be such growth strategy, a growth green strategy which has a great ambition, because the Green Deal aims at achieving a prosperous and inclusive and climate neutral economy by 2050, while enhancing Europe's natural capital and biodiversity. However, in my opinion, in order to achieve such great ambition, the EU Green Deal still needs to address more holistically, in a more transformative way, many issues which are currently addressed separately in the Green Deal and whose root causes are still interconnected. Because the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and even the health crisis that we are facing, in my opinion, they are just different phases of the same crisis, the crisis of our fossil-based economy. The coronavirus pandemic is just another wake-up call regarding the fact that we are crossing the resilience boundaries of our planet and therefore of our economy. Science shows that biodiversity loss and deforestation are important factors behind the emergence and transmission of zoonotic disease like COVID-19. So in my opinion, the world that we have created have become too big for our planet. And I think in that context, I believe that a concept that is currently missing in the EU Green Deal, the concept of the bioeconomy, provides us with the right conceptual framework to be able to connect and address more holistically questions like climate change, biodiversity loss, inclusive prosperity, and even the circular economy, which are currently addressed not in an integrated and effective manner. So I would like to give you three very brief examples on why I believe that the bioeconomy is the missing link connecting the dots in the EU Green Deal. First, the bioeconomy, an economy powered by nature and based on the sustainable use of biological resources, is a great opportunity to place nature and biodiversity at the center of our economy. This is because biodiversity it provides the conditions, it determines the capacity of our ecosystems and biological resources to adapt and evolve in a changing environment. So investing in biodiversity should be a priority, a precondition for a long-term sustainable and resilient bioeconomy. Without biodiversity, there is no bioeconomy. But at the same time, a long-term predictable, profitable, and sustainable bioeconomy can provide the right incentives to forest owners, farmers, and related industries to invest back in nature to enhance biodiversity, which is one of the priorities of the Green Deal. Second example, bioeconomy is crucial for inclusive prosperity and a socially fair transition as the EU Green Deal ambitions. And this is paradoxically related to one of the theoretical disadvantages of the bioeconomy compared to the fossil-based economy. This is because mobilizing, transporting, and processing biological resources tends to be more costly and more complex when compared to fossil resources. This is due to the nature, distribution, and ownership of biological resources. But Such disadvantage is at the same time one of the greatest advantages of the bioeconomy, because it provides an opportunity for inclusive prosperity to distribute wealth, jobs, and infrastructure in wider parts of our territory, including rural and remote areas. Just consider our forests cover 40% of the European land. The European forest sector provides more than 3 million jobs. This is many more than the 3 energy-intensive industries of steel, cement, and chemicals altogether. Such industries in the Green Deal are called as indispensable industries for Europe's economy. Page number 7. The European forest sector also includes 400,000 small and medium enterprises and 60 million forest owners. This is an incredible socio-ecological infrastructure that is currently totally absent in the EU Green Deal. I really wonder, and I hope some of you can answer this question, but I really wonder how we can put forward our green growth strategy without considering those who are managing the most important green infrastructure in our continent. Third example, the Green Deal aims at achieving a climate neutral and resource efficient Europe. This requires not only moving towards fossil-free energy, but also to move towards fossil-free materials. We need to replace carbon-intense and resource-intense materials like plastics, concrete, and steel. And the only alternative that we have to do that is the sustainable production of renewable bio-based solutions. And the bioeconomy can deliver that using the latest science and technology. At the same time, the bioeconomy is an opportunity to modernize our industry, to make it circular and renewable, because biological resources, if managed sustainably, are circular and renewable by nature. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, just to finish, I would like to highlight that the EU Green Deal is a great opportunity to put forward a new economic paradigm for Europe. But to do that, the Green Deal needs to overcome the past dichotomy between ecology and economy by building a new and synergistic relationship between bioeconomy and biodiversity as basis for a new circular bioeconomy centered around people and nature. That's all from my side. I wish you a very interesting seminar. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marc. And now to Janez Potočnik.
Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to participate on this seminar today. Dear friends, as already mentioned by Marc, world and Europe are facing 3 crises: the acute temporary coronavirus health crisis, the acute economic social crisis due to the economic lockdown, and finally, the most important one, the crisis with a deeper roots, a chronic one, of globalization and the needed economic transformation. The latter has been feeding climate change and income inequality, and it's rapidly leading to the massive unemployment. One thing is certain. It is good that the European Commission adopted the European Green Deal and some other important documents operationalizing it before the COVID-19 outbreak. One can hardly imagine that all these documents would look the same as they are looking as if they would be adopted today. Many are saying that the world after the COVID-19 will be different. It will not be different. It will be the same as it was, but we will hopefully understand it better and also act accordingly. None of the challenges we have identified till a few months ago have disappeared. We only have one more, one we could predict better and one we could prepare better, but the lesson from previous health crises were obviously not learned well. The most important lesson, rather the fact we will hopefully understand better, is that we are for the first time facing the emergence of a single, tightly coupled human socio-ecological system of planetary scope. We are more vulnerable and fragile, more interconnected and interdependent than ever. The severity and frequency of health-related outbreaks climate-related extreme weather events will in the future very likely increase. We need to rethink the way we are managing the risks individually and collectively in the private sector, in the public sector, locally and globally. We need to be better prepared, and we need to do everything to limit these unwanted but likely events. We need to create resilient economies and resilient societies. European Green Deal is, and I'm quoting and repeating what Marc already said, a new growth strategy that aims to transform the European Union into a fair and prosperous society with a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy where there are no net emissions of greenhouse gases in 2050 and where economic growth is decoupled from resource use. It aims to protect, conserve, and enhance European Union's natural capital and protect the health and well-being of citizens from environment-related risks and impacts. At the same time, the transition must be just and inclusive. It is an integral part of the European Commission strategy to implement the United Nations 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. Communication, it's an initial roadmap of the key policies and measures needed to achieve the European Green Deal. It will be updated as needs evolve and the policy responses are formulated. All European Union actions and policies will have to contribute to the Green Deal objectives. All these, by the way, were quotes from the European Green Deal. Three key challenges and objectives for Europe in a new industrial strategy following the Green Deal are the framework conditions for fair competition in the single market and the international market, transition to a climate neutral and circular economy, and digitalization. Europe embarks on its transition towards climate neutrality and digital leadership in an ever-changing and ever more unpredictable world. A new industrial strategy here, it's again clear, and I'm quoting, the business case is as strong as the environmental and moral. Ladies and gentlemen, not many are aware that the precautionary principle is part of the European law. It is detailed in Article 191 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. It aims in the first place to ensuring a higher level of environmental protection through preventive decision taking in the case of a risk. If we are honest, we have to admit that nobody actually knows how it could be implemented in practice. But one of the lessons from the current COVID-19 crisis is that maybe walking in real life a bit more on the safe side of the precautionary principle, it could actually save jobs, if saving lives is sometimes not enough convincing argument. It is true that there is a gap in the ambition set in the opening of the European Green Deal and strategic vision for needed system changes in the following concrete policy chapters. That inconsistency exists among the ambition set in the document and the budgetary proposal set by the previous European Commission. That the document, it's a bit climate biased when it comes to the attention of biodiversity, including forests, and zero pollution. That the full costs of natural capital use, so-called externalities, are not addressed in a convincing way. That clear orientation in the direction of dematerialization, rethinking the concept of ownership and moving from resource efficiency to resource sufficiency are missing. That chapters talking about the transformation of food, buildings, mobility are designed without the real system change logic and needs. That there is clearly a need for a European sustainable land use roadmap till 2050, addressing the potential cascading approach to land use and existing trade-offs. It is also true that the role of the circular bioeconomy and forest could and should be better addressed, and that the importance of finance and innovative thinking and global governance lack convincing answers. But one thing is clear anyway. European Green Deal, it's a real novelty. It's a minor miracle in the approach to policy making. And European Union and European Commission in particular needs in the first place an appreciation of the work done and a very sincere help in filling some of the gaps identified. Filling some of the gaps identified also when it comes to the role of circular bioeconomy and forests in particular. So it is on us to design convincing proposals. It is on us to prepare convincing arguments. It is on us to provide sincere help. I wish you a productive seminar.
Thank you very much, Janez. Thank you, Marc, for some very insightful and important words that truly carry a lot of weight. Very good start for our webinar here today. But now we turn to you, to the audience, and we'll be running our very first poll today, launching it out there. And the very first question we'd like to get your opinions on is, should forest bioeconomy be included in Green Deal proposal more than it is now? 1, no, keep it as it is. Yes, update it to put more emphasis on forest bioeconomy and its diverse possibilities to contribute to Green Deal. And 3rd, do not know. And we're seeing the percentages racing there quickly already. Can already say that the answer number 2, yes, update it to put more emphasis, won by a landslide. Would Janez or Marc like to comment it briefly? Are the results acceptable, or did you accept them?
The results are self-explanatory, so they don't need any comment, in my opinion.
Right.
What to say, it's obvious.
Yes. So then we go to the poll number 2. If you had to choose only one, what should be the main role of the EU forest-based sector in the European Green Deal? Number 1, increasing forest sinks to mitigate climate change. 2, protection and recovery of biodiversity. Or 3, forest bioeconomy helping to mitigate climate change by replacing fossil-based materials such as concrete, steel, plastic, textile, and energy, gold class oil. And the votes are coming in. Okay, and we can also here see where the most of the answers are going to. Forest bioeconomy helping to mitigate climate change by replacing fossil-based materials. Also self-explanatory, or would you like to comment on this result as well?
Yeah, if I can comment, I didn't answer. Why? Because the question is wrong. I think all 3 should and could and should be combined. And if we go in only one direction, it's simply wrong.
I fully agree with Janez. This is, I think it's in my opinion, a wrong question. So you cannot have one without the other. So if you want to go for one in the short term, you will manage, but in the long term you will fail. So I think it's a matter, you cannot have one without the other.
I think that this question was provocative by design to get some kind of debate going on here. But I think we'll be getting back to these subjects later on today. But very good. Thank you very much for very active audience participation. And now let's move on to our next speaker in the program. And just a minute. He will be Gert-Jan Nabuurs from Wageningen University and talking about climate smart forestry and the Green Deal. Gert-Jan is professor of European forest resources at Wageningen University and a senior researcher at Wageningen Environmental Research. His background is in European scale forest resource analysis and management under climate change. Gert-Jan Nabuurs, the screen is yours.
So, thank you very much, Marcus, and the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present the views based on research and our views on the role of European climate smart forestry in the Green Deal. I will present what is climate smart forestry in all its diversity, and what can it contribute in the Green Deal, in the variety of goals which is in the Green Deal. And I will get right into the topic, because the main question is when we need to reduce our fossil carbon consumption, and that is certainly the way where we're heading to, then land is the only place where we, with now 7.5 billion people, can get our resources from. We will rely more and more in the future on renewable resources. And that is a major challenge, where to get those resources from in a sustainable way, addressing all the functions of the European forest. And that is what I'll try to address with climate smart forestry. But first, I think that quite some from the audience maybe have not read the Green Deal. So I have to put in a couple of slides with short quotes, what is actually in the Green Deal in the text in terms of forests and biodiversity. And on biodiversity, it's very clear. There has to be a new biodiversity strategy by March 2020, and I think it was actually released yesterday or today, with global targets to protect biodiversity, and it has to address the causes of biodiversity loss. The biodiversity strategy will also identify specific measures, for example, increasing the coverage of protected biodiversity-rich land areas. And it has to aim at improving and restoring the damaged ecosystems. That is, in short, what it says on biodiversity. On forests, it says, well, forest ecosystems are under increasing pressure as a result of climate change. So the EU's forested areas need to improve both in quality and quantity. And for example, sustainable and afforestation needs to take place, but as well restoration of degraded forests, and in that way, increasing the absorption of CO2, improving the resilience to climate change and other stresses, and promoting the circular bioeconomy. So the term bioeconomy is there in the Green Deal. And the forest strategy, it then says, has to build on the biodiversity strategy. So the Commission will prepare an EU forest strategy. My last one on the Green Deal, what is actually in there, is that this new EU forest strategy will have key objectives on this afforestation, but also on forest preservation and restoration. Again, increase absorption of CO2, reduce the incidence and extent of forest fires, promote the bioeconomy is there again, second time. In full respect for ecological principles. And it then makes a note that there will be national strategic plans to execute and further implement this EU forest strategy. So far, this is very briefly what is in the Green Deal text from December last year. So can climate smart forestry be an answer in some of these challenges that we face, that are partly mentioned in the Green Deal, but that we also see in our research, etc. For example, in the bottom right here, you see a tree species map of Europe. There's a huge diversity of forest types and management systems across Europe. And we have indeed more forests in Europe than ever since the early medieval times. And that is a major achievement. But there are also challenges. Certainly biodiversity is under pressure, even if we have more forest area and higher growing stocks than ever before. There are certainly pressures on biodiversity. On the right, top right, a picture of wood prepared for a household stove, and actually a large amount of wood actually ends up directly in this way, going into the household stoves. More than 120 million cubic meters is harvested and used in that way. And I'm not talking about highly efficient, maybe biomass plants, but it's this household stoves that really consume more than 20% of the EU wood harvest, burning at a very low efficiency and a very low efficiency of use, you could say. the top left, you can see again the diversity across Europe. This is the forest harvesting intensity as a percentage of the increment, and where it's in the yellowish and the orange, it's roughly 100% of the increment which is being harvested. So not 100% of the stock, but 100% of the increment. And it's very diverse. You see that most of the harvesting pressure is in Central East Europe, the Baltics, Southern Scandinavia. A very little pressure is in the South and Southwest. It has to do with socioeconomic circumstances, the state of the forest sector, the state of the forest resources, the regional demand. So it's highly diverse. And if we want to, for example, if we say that we need more resources for a bioeconomy, it shows that it's not so easy to mobilize those resources. In East and Northern Europe, the pressure is already relatively high. And in the South and Southwest, there are very good reasons why the harvesting pressure is low. So it's not so easy to mobilize more wood. And then in the bottom left, there's a picture of the Harz mountains in Germany, and all the brownish is died spruce, which died in 2018, 2019 because of the drought and then bark beetles. And overall in Central Europe, the spruce mortality is taking off really at enormous scales, which we have never seen. More than 200 million cubic meters has died already. And leading to an overflow of cheap resources, that's one side, but also leading to big challenges how to move further with these forests, how to adapt them to climate change, which tree species then to plant for the future. It leads to enormous challenges in Central Europe. So we have quite some challenges in Europe's forests. So climate smart forestry, can it help a little bit in this? And in order to start talking about this, I'll go back to 2015 when at the COP25 in Paris, we launched this idea of climate smart forestry, addressing both mitigation, adaptation, and also maintaining the productivity, and especially also emphasizing the diversity of functions across the European forests. Here you see a carbon balance depicted for the whole system. In climate smart forestry, we certainly look at the whole system. It's the carbon in the forest ecosystem and the soils, but also the carbon in the wood products, and then also a substitution effect by avoiding the use of fossil fuels for energy and materials. And that whole picture is part of the climate smart forestry greenhouse gas balance. We found that if you look at a variety of measures across Europe and really looking at the local circumstances, then apart from the 10–11% mitigation, what the European forests are doing now, you can increase this mitigation up to 20% of the current EU emissions. And we quantified a number of measures in the improved forest management, in the current forest. There's a lot of outgrown coppice in Europe, for example, which you can improve. Other forest types where you can enhance the productivity, trying to reduce disturbances. And Europe also has a little bit of deforestation, trying to stop that. And the material substitution effect of wood products, that together could give an additional 170 million tons of CO2 mitigation. A little bit of forest area expansion we quantified as well, not enormous, roughly 20 million hectares we thought might be available without harming the food production, which is very important, of course. Energy substitution part is there as well, which is relatively high because in the end, all the wood that is harvested ends up in some sort of incinerator. But also paying attention to biodiversity. Establishing strict reserves in a small part of Europe's forest is possible without harming other functions and addressing biodiversity. And that would give an additional 64 million tons. Altogether, an additional more than 400 million tons of CO2, what we thought and quantified is possible from climate smart forestry. And it's really looking at the local circumstances. If you have a forest like this, which is on the picture, which you can characterize as a bit of a degraded forest, It has been thinned over and over again. There is not a lot of regeneration. The wood production is not high. The carbon stock is not high. The biodiversity values are probably very limited. So, and then that's is the kind of forest that we have quite a lot in Europe, which you can revitalize and improve. So you really look at the local circumstances. For example, if you have storm-prone areas, you can try to bring down the growing stock, make it less susceptible. From the wood you harvest, you also invest in new wood-based products. Drained peatlands, we have quite some forests in, for example, in Scotland, or in some places where it's not so productive and not functioning so well, you can think of reducing the drainage and going back to the swamp-like forests. Remote areas, I mentioned that strict reserves are an option there. Coppice I mentioned, so the mortality in spruce regenerate with adapted species. So it's really this variety of measures which you have, which you can implement in the various forest types. So this is once more, it's visualized how this can work out, the climate smart forestry effect over time. It's a bit complicated graph, but I'll get you through there. And this is the past statistics. In black, it's the emissions from fossil fuels. In green, this is the forest sink, the current forest sink, which we have roughly 400 million tons of CO2. These are the targets, and these, for example, this EU emission reduction target of -40 is probably going to be strengthened under the Green Deal. How these targets are foreseen to come down. And then in purple, well, we have assumed that you manage to maintain your current sink in the forest, and then in purple, here you see the additional climate smart forestry effect. But we also know this is an EU picture. If you really start looking into the local circumstances, it's not always that you immediately have this positive climate smart forestry effect. You can, if you start to work in your forests, for example, in the dyed spruce forests, and you start to regenerate that more fast, you can also take your forest through a temporary source. And that's also part of the thing that if we have a sink, you cannot always maintain that sink. Then we worked further on this and also tried to take a top-down look at how management can be more optimized across Europe, spatially diverse at the 1 by 1 kilometer resolution. And we do think that if you take into account all various layers of information that you have for Europe, you can more optimally strategize the management. From the dark green, which are strict reserves in some locations, usually the more remote, the less accessible regions, up to multifunctional in the orange, and in some places you will need a more intensive forest management. We've tried to optimize it slightly. It's not a full optimization, because with a full optimization you would drastically start to change your forest resources, and that is, would never be seen as a sustainable forest management. What we can do with this, we learn from this, we can use it as a tool. And for example, set aside a strict reserves of 7 million hectares across the EU. So it is feasible, we find, and it's certainly no problem for the wood production. So you can fulfill these different functions very well. And coming back to that second question in the poll, indeed, a lot of people, and Janez also mentioned that we cannot really choose for one or the other. You really can address the variety of functions. And this is a further projection of the sink. The negative number is means that the forest resources are acting as a sink at the moment, close to 400 million tons of CO2. If we do nothing, if we do not invest in any kind of forest management, in regenerating and using the products, etc., and establishing those reserves, that sink is certainly going to saturate. In various options which we calculated here with the EFISM model, it's almost unavoidable that this sink is going to saturate. So we need to take action in order to avoid that. And I'm coming to the closing. I mentioned climate much more forestry, the European view, how you can downscale it. And well, this is an example of that it's actually already happening. A lot of countries, I must say, are dealing now with this paradigm of climate smart forestry, having various implementation ideas, research ideas already. For example, the Dutch government also invested in this under the Dutch Climate Accord with €2 million per year. We are setting up forestry pilots on climate smart forestry. It's a wide variety of measures. You can also deal with it within a national level. And the results are being taken up in the climate smart forestry toolbox, which unfortunately is in Dutch. We will work on that. And together with EFI and with some Dutch startup funding, we will now start setting up a climate smart forestry network across Europe. So in my mind, climate smart forestry is key to understanding these potential trade-offs, also between mitigation, adaptation, bioeconomy, biodiversity, these various functions I keep addressing. And still under this notion that if and when we will start to use far less fossil fuels, we will need to invest in these renewable resources. Now, once more, the climate smart forestry quantitative effect, we do think it can mitigate 20% of the EU emissions, and then finally lead even to this net zero, where you still have some fossil fuel emissions, but with the things on the land, you can achieve net zero. And the Green Deal, in my mind, is indeed, like what was said, it's a small miracle, it's a big miracle maybe. It will now need to be taken further in very strong regulations and strategies, fulfilling all these functions. And with this, I close my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gert-Jan, for a very, very informative and insightful presentation. We're running a little late in our schedule. So many interesting topics that we can elaborate on, but I'll pick up a couple of questions here anyway to Gert-Jan. And let's take the very first one from Pauli. Where does the Green Deal put us on the topic of carbon credits and carbon market access, especially when it comes to incentivizing and afforestation, but also enhancing interesting agroforest practices, which aren't usually integrated with the above mentioned carbon market? Do you have an answer for that?
Do I have an answer?
Very tough question.
At the moment, as you know, there's not really a market for carbon credits, for credits derived from actions on the land. And that has partly to do with the huge uncertainty of the carbon balance on the land and the uncertainty of the additionality of the measures that you take. And so indeed, if I'm right, the Green Deal doesn't even mention anything on carbon credits, but I'm sure the Commission is working in direction on how a carbon market could lead to incentivizing actions on the land as well. As you know, because of the uncertainty in this land sector, LULUCF sector as it's abbreviated, this uncertainty led to that the previous LULUCF regulation does not set very strong targets for the LULUCF sector. And it just wants to keep the sink basically as it is. So there are no incentives to have a carbon credits market for land carbon.
Thank you very much. A very quick one from Ireland. Gert, what do you think we should do about spruce forests, particularly in Ireland? They're posing a difficulty to Ireland's afforestation program, from Robin Page Common. Do you have any take on that?
Yeah. Indeed, in Ireland, it's quite often it's Sitka spruce. A lot of it was planted in the 90s with subsidies for afforestation. It's private forest very often, also aiming at renewable resources. I do think that sort of forest types we also need, with a but that we have to probably aim for a larger diversity of forest types. Also in these countries, in like Scotland and Ireland, where you have a lot of Sitka spruce, this larger diversity of forest types and management types will be needed. And if you had asked me 5-6 years ago what I thought about Norway spruce in Central Europe, then I would have been reasonably positive about it. but you can see how dramatically fast these things change with the 2018 and 2019 growth.
Thank you very much. And now it's time for us to move forward. And our next speaker will be Jürgen Bauhus from the University of Freiburg, and he'll be talking about forest biodiversity and the Green Deal. Jürgen is professor of silviculture at the Faculty of Environment and Natural Resources at Freiburg University, and also currently chairperson of the Scientific Advisory Board on Forest Policy at the German Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture. Jürgen Bauhus, the screen is yours.
So thank you very much for the kind introduction and also the opportunity to speak here. I hope you can all see my screen with the view from the Black Forest onto Freiburg, where I'm sitting at the moment. So like Gert-Jan, I was going to say a few words what the Green Deal actually says at the moment about forests and biodiversity. We have these nice pamphlets like here in German. And what we can see is that this Green Deal with regards to biodiversity is based on two main pillars, namely the EU biodiversity strategy, which has already been mentioned, which is currently under development or just released. And there the two pillars are a protected area network and a nature restoration plan. And there will be a new EU forest strategy, but work on that has not really commenced as far as I understand. And both of these aim at improving the quality of European forest and expanding their area. And let's have a look at some of the measures here in detail. So the new EU biodiversity or the draft strategy says that there should be at least 30% of the land protected in the EU. That's an extra 4%, and 1/3 of this, so 10%, under strict protection. But it doesn't say in which part of the landscape that should be. The areas of very high biodiversity value or potential, and those that are most vulnerable to climate change, in particular remaining primary and old growth forests, should be granted special care in form of strict protection. And in addition, it aims at effectively managing all protected areas, particularly those under the Natura 2000 network, with defining clear conservation objectives and measures and monitoring them appropriately. And the measures regarding the second pillar here, the nature restoration plan, spells out commitments that should be achieved by 2030. So by next year, the EU aims at defining clear nature restoration targets and aims at then significant areas of degraded and carbon-rich ecosystems to be restored. The habitats and species under the Habitats and Birds directives show no deterioration in conservation trends and status by 2030, and at least 30% of those which are currently not in favorable conservation status shall reach such status, or at least show a positive trend. As we know, the situation regarding biodiversity is quite different between forests and the agricultural landscape. And here the goal is that at least 10% of the utilized agricultural area is in high diversity landscapes, such as buffer strips or landscape features, such as hedges and non-productive trees, etc. And this is also meant to be facilitated through a support of agroforestry. And last but not least, an additional 3 billion trees shall be planted, also in the agricultural landscape, but also in urban areas. Well, what does that mean to protection of forest biodiversity? I think to elaborate on that, we need to consider what really are the forest biodiversity challenges that we're facing. And I have a list here that I think are the most important ones. Probably there are some minor points missing, but it's clearly climate change impacts on our ecosystems. It's new pests and diseases, land use changes, such as conversion of native ecosystems and fragmentation, the harvesting of forests, impacts of surrounding land use, for example, drifts of pesticides from adjacent agricultural areas, but also historic changes to our forests through the composition. We've already heard about the problems we're currently facing with some of the secondary conifer forests, but also the lack of old forest structures. Another issue is that some of the biodiversity-rich historical forest lands, such as coppice lands or coppice with standards, are being abandoned, and the species that depend on them suffer. We have widespread eutrophication with continuing nitrogen inputs, and last but not least, invasive species. Now, how do these proposed measures address these issues? Let's take one example. If we look at climate change impacts for the moment, then we see that protection, on the one side because it covers only a small proportion of the land, but also because it can only be effective in systems that have an inherent adaptive capacity or high resilience would be effective. Measures such as active management through restoration and adaptation would be far more important across the forest landscape in Europe. Expansion of forest area will contribute only very little through its mitigating effects, and perhaps also through providing more connections between forest remnants. But to a large extent, whatever happens here is outside the control of the forestry and conservation sector. So we have to deal with impacts that we cannot fix on the ground. If we go a step further and look at all the other effects, then we might get a picture like this. And I won't talk you through here in detail, no worry. And we might pick up some of these links here later on. What I'm trying to point out is that protection, strict protection, or the Natura 2000 reserve, they can only address really a few issues that we have. Restoration, adaptation, and active management addresses many more and more of the important issues that we were facing with biodiversity conservation in forests. Expansion has little influence, and there are still many factors that are outside control of the forestry and conservation sector. And let's look at a few examples of these issues that I'm mentioning here. We will not be able to cover all of them. Climate change impacts have been mentioned, and Gert-Jan has had even more impressive pictures of dieback in spruce forests than the one here on the top right corner. And this has initially been attributed also to, say, the wrong form of forestry, and that's certainly partially true. But we see similar effects now here in the bottom right with dieback in native forests, native beech forests in national park, such as here in the Hainich area in Germany, and also more frequent and more intense fires here, particularly in the Mediterranean or also in the boreal area. And what that means is that we might run into problems with our reserves, which will face novel climatic conditions. There's been a very interesting recent study that looked at the conditions that will be faced by protected areas across the world. And it finds that sort of between 37 to 45% of the protected areas in Mediterranean, temperate and boreal forest biomes, so those that are relevant for Europe, will face climatic conditions that they've never experienced before by 2070. And this is under an optimistic climate change scenario, so probably worse under a more pessimistic scenario. And the authors conclude that it would be necessary to revise the current conservation policy towards more proactive biodiversity management, and that we need to overcome static applications of spatial conservation. So to respond more flexibly and make sure that species can survive in the landscape also outside of the current reserves that are under threat. Let's move to another issue that's often forgotten, namely the influence of new pests and diseases. Recently, the new European Red List of trees has been published, and it comes to the conclusion or to the assessment that 42% of European tree species have a high risk of extinction, and new pests and diseases are a large part of that. And we see here on the right side a forest which is a mixed oak and ash forest, and we see a lot of ash dieback. We're currently losing this species, similar to what has happened to the elms, which we have largely lost. And of course, if we lose tree species, we lose all the dependent taxa that rely on these species. And this is even more so important as we have recently seen that, and this is what is shown in this publication here, highlighted on the top right corner, that we have found that the tree diversity is actually one of the most important components that support dependent taxonomic diversity in our forests. In addition, we have to realize that biodiversity is not just influenced by what is happening in forests. We have heard a lot about the decline of insects and the related decline of birds, mostly a phenomenon in agricultural landscapes. But we have found recently that we also in forests find, as you can see here on the right side, decline in the biomass or the species number of arthropods. And even over a short period of time of 10 years, these numbers have decreased by 41 to 36%. So this is alarming. But the interesting other finding of this study was that this decline was not driven by forest management intensity, but related to factors outside of forests. The authors here have called for habitat management at the landscape scale and across land use forms to address this issue. And old growth forests have received particular mention also in the biodiversity strategy. And they're certainly a highly underprotected form of forest. In a recent analysis, we have seen that less than 1% of Europe's forests are actually in a primary or old growth condition. Most of that is protected, 89%, but only 46% in strict reserves. However, if you look at a map of Europe, which you see here on the left, we see that to improve the status of old growth, we may move for old growth forests that are not protected yet into reserve. These are the beige to brown colors, or the status may be changed from protected to strictly protected. These are the pinkish colors, but to achieve a desired proportion of old growth in the landscape, restoration would be required, and that is the blue color. And as you can see, Europe is largely blue because we're lacking this, and we would only achieve these restoration goals by active management and development of old growth features. If we pick up the term climate smart forestry and translate that to biodiversity smart forestry, we have to concede that we also need smart approaches. And in the cultural landscape of Europe, that means we need approaches that extend across forests. So our reserves, such as national park or forest reserves, will cover only small parts of the landscape. At the moment, we have a few percent, and this is mostly on public land. In Europe, more than 60% of the forest land is on private land. And if we really want to maintain genetic diversity, if we want to maintain the movement of species and the movement to new refugia and new ecosystems, we need to provide also habitat and diversity in all the forest landscape. So it requires measures such as close to nature silviculture, structural retention of habitat trees, dead wood, specific old growth stands, and so on. And this really requires that all forest owners should be involved and provide, we need to provide significant support to them. That becomes more obvious when you look at the distribution of forest ownership across Europe. When you see here on the left side Sweden, or on the right side Italy, we see European landscapes that are dominated by private forest owners, which are the dark purple color here. So if we really want to achieve that, we have to bring these people on board. To summarize, I think it is very clear that pressures from external drivers on forest biodiversity need to be reduced. And this is climate, first of all, but it's also biosecurity. We need to stop bringing in new pests and diseases, and I didn't find anything in that in the biodiversity strategy. The aim to increase strictly protected areas in forests, which by nature in Europe are relatively small and so far have been spatially static, will be of limited success for biodiversity conservation, with many of the challenges ahead. For a large part of the landscape, we need active management and restoration to provide habitats and maintain ecosystem functionality. And when we start bringing trees and forests back into the agricultural land, which could improve biodiversity, we may actually also reduce pressure on existing forests. That's perhaps a point that we can discuss later. I didn't have time to elaborate that here. Let me finish with some recommendations. Yes, we should definitely protect, restore, and connect biodiversity hotspots. But we need to increase the adaptive capacity and restore biodiversity and ecosystem functioning of all forests. So not just strict reserves, not just the Natura 2000 network, all forests. And to achieve that, we need to provide incentives to forest owners to engage in forest restoration and conservation. And these incentives should be outcome oriented, unlike much of what has happened in the past in agriculture. And the instruments should be flexible to bring forest owners on board. We need to make them biodiversity providers and pay for that. And for that, we really need a new model of forest management. Forest management as it's happened in the past, that, for example, in this case here, the provision of biodiversity and habitats, but also with regards to climate, the provision of other ecosystem functions, has mostly been paid by the revenue from timber harvesting. And this will not work in future. No, not if climate change is keeping on affecting forests with the same velocity that we see at the moment. So we really need a new deal, and the Green Deal may be suited for that. But in the biodiversity strategy so far, there's not much mentioned of a new model for forest management. Maybe the bioeconomy can serve as a framework for that, as Marc Palahí has mentioned in the opening address. But we certainly would require a strong forest strategy that would address a new model of forest management. And with that, I thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jürgen, for a very insightful presentation. We have a lot of great questions here, but I'm sorry we only have time for one. And as the dictator here, sitting on this chair, I get to choose the one. I think this one was a very interesting one. Why do you think that increasing the proportion of protected areas is not the most promising approach?
Well, we have to see the issues that are affecting biodiversity. And as I mentioned, in my view, climate change is one of the most important. New pests and diseases is another one. And how do reserves address this issue? In the past, our reserves have, for example, not been selected on the criterion how resistant will they be, or how resilient will they be to climate change. Now, when we see maps that look at the reserves that are currently at risk with the projected climate changes, this covers a large proportion of the landscape. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't have reserves, but to have them spatially fixed in areas that are under high threat of climate change will probably miss the conservation goals.
Right. Very good, thank you. Our next speaker, Lauri Hetemäki, will be talking about bioeconomy and the Green Deal. Lauri Hetemäki is the Assistant Director at the European Forest Institute and is responsible for managing the Institute's science policy work. He's also a adjunct professor at the Faculty of Agriculture and Forestry at the University of Helsinki. Lauri Hetemäki is a fellow of the Royal Swedish Academy of Agriculture and Forestry. Lauri, the screen is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Marcus. Let me share the screen with you. I hope you are able to see the screen.
Very good.
Is that correct?
Good, yes.
Okay, so good morning from Helsinki. The background picture is not Helsinki, it's Koli in Finland, but here I am in Helsinki. In the next minutes, I want to share you with some ideas how forest-based bioeconomy could be related to the Green Deal. My main point is that the EU Green Deal is a very welcome and necessary, we need it, but it needs updating to be even stronger. And the whole presentation is discussing how we can make it stronger. The presentation reflects my interpretation of the science studies that has been carried out by EFI in the past 5 years under the Multi-Donor Trust Fund for Policy Support. I have given the references in the last slide, but I will not go them through. You can look at them yourself. So how does Green Deal see forest bioeconomy? I would say that it hardly sees it at all. For example, there's no reference to the EU bioeconomy strategy that was published only 2 years ago. I think this is an indication of the issue also. The forests, they are seen in a rather narrow perspective, discussing mainly the zinc and biodiversity issue, which of course are very important. But I think seeing them separately is not good for the zinc and biodiversity either. There are few statements of the multiple benefits of forest that they provide to society. Thinking about the history, let's say 1,000 years backwards, and you see how many ways the forests have been used and what purposes they have been used for, and then you suddenly see a big policy document that takes a very narrow perspective. It sounds strange. So I would argue that the EU forest-based sector can do much more for reaching the Green Deal climate, biodiversity, economic and social objective than it does now. And the post-COVID recovery enhances this point, and I hope I will be able to show that. If you just look at the possibilities of EU forest-based sector to mitigate climate, I have here listed several categories, and Gert-Jan was already in his presentation on climate smart forestry referring to these. The biophysical one is of course very important, the carbon sequestration and on trees and soil. This is the main focus of the Green Deal. It does not discuss very much of the other possibilities. Of course, we have the forest disturbances that was mentioned by Jürgen also, the substitution possibility to replace fossil-based materials and energy, and storage of carbon in forest products. One thing that is often missed when we discuss the mitigation impacts is the environmental, socio-economic and political context. And I think IPCC has been very good in the recent years in the report stressing that if you want to mitigate climate change, you cannot only address climate change, but you have to see the more larger perspective. And especially we want to advance climate mitigation in a way that it also serves the sustainable development goals. And if you have that approach, you immediately need to think several different things that are, for example, listed in the slide. Of course, the forest products industry itself is creating emissions when it's using fossil-based raw materials, and there's an option also to decrease the footprint. I think biodiversity, climate mitigation, and adaptation to the changing climate are all married. So if we think about keeping the forest sinks, for example, and thinking that the forest disturbances can be a risk for the sinks and also for biodiversity, it's important to adapt the forest to the changing climate, and that requires management. For example, transfer from monoculture to mixed species forests. In the Green Deal, it very much emphasizes afforestation, reforestation, and it tends to have a sort of a tendency of one-size-fits-all policy. But if I, for example, think about Spain, for example, in the last 30 years, the forest area of Spain has increased by 1/3. And I think in terms of climate policy, the much more pressing issue in Spain is the forest disturbances like the forest fires and also the soil erosion. So I wonder to what extent it makes sense, for example, in the Spain, just to focus on afforestation rather than also on reducing the forest disturbances and other matters. How are adaptation, resilience, and forest management funded? For example, if I look at my home country, Finland, in 2018, around 250 million euros was spent on forest management. Of this 250 million, taxpayers paid about 20%, so 1/5. I think it is very unrealistic, especially thinking about the post-COVID situation, that we will get more money from taxpayers for forest management. So it depends on how much forest owners and forest industry is actually investing in the management. And they need to have incentives and income to do that. And I think, therefore, there's also a need for bioeconomy. When we think about the EU's roles in global climate change, I sometimes have a feeling that we tend to look the global climate only from the EU perspective, that we do measures in EU and we think what they have in the EU setting, what impacts. But I think we need to have this global setting in the mind also when we think different measures in the European Union. If you look at the EU forest area, it's not actually very huge. It's only 4% of the total world forest area. For example, Brazil alone has 4 times more forest than EU, and Brazil and Russia together 1/3 of the world forests. On the other hand, if you look at how much EU is producing forest products and exporting them, the value is 42% of the total value of forest exports in the world, whereas Brazil and Russia only together 7%. I think if you stop to think these two figures, it raises many questions, at least to me, and many observations. I think one observation is that even if EU is a big country in terms of forest products or bioeconomy, the challenges that the forests are facing in EU compared to Brazil and Russia do not seem to be that challenging that we have in Brazil and Russia. And in terms of bioeconomy, it does not make forest necessarily, the lack of bioeconomy does not make forest more resilient. It could be the contrary. And I think in the future, when we think that we need to replace the fossil products and materials, the forest products can play a bigger role, and EU has also an opportunity to bring new innovative products that can be helping in this replacement. So I think you need to think these scales at the global level also when thinking what we are doing in EU. I think there's a large agreement that we have at least two important priorities in the forthcoming years in the European Union. Of course, the carbon neutrality by 2050 and advancing the sustainable development goals. And now, of course, the economic recovery post-COVID. Therefore, we need a strategy that helps to reach these different priorities simultaneously. And I think it is once in a lifetime chance to do this. Why? Recently, both European Parliament and some of the member states have been discussing about the recovery package, going from 500 billion euros to 2 trillion euros. And this Monday, Germany and France were giving a joint a press release where they were saying that the Green Deal needs to be also an economic growth program. And clearly, I think they are stressing also that the need to reach these different priorities simultaneously. One key of this recovery process will be the need to phase out the energy and material sectors that are based on fossil raw materials. We need to cut, of course, down unnecessary consumption and increase resource efficiency and resource recovery, a circularity of the economy. We need to invest in new employment and income opportunities. I think the sustainable circular bioeconomy is the necessary part of achieving all these. I don't see very much alternative possibilities. One issue that the Green Deal is not very detailed is the employment and social issues. If you think especially the post-recovery issue where everyone's mind is in the lost jobs and unemployment, this becomes even more important. And then, of course, when we phase out the fossil-based sector, it will create a loss of jobs. I've rarely seen any sort of outlook what it actually in numbers could mean. So I did a hypothetical example that if the EU primary fossil-based sector is reducing its emissions by 75%, what would that mean perhaps for the employment? Making some very simple assumptions, I came up with a number of 140,000 lost jobs by 2050. The number could be something different, but I think the figure will have 6 numbers in it. So we need to create new job to compensate for the lost one, and the circular bioeconomy certainly could be one of those. Green Deal should address synergies and trade-offs that we have in the forest sector. Now it's more perhaps implicitly assuming trade-offs. Of course, there will be trade-offs, but there will be also synergies. We have already, Marc mentioned that biodiversity is the prerequisite for sustainable, resilient bioeconomy. We cannot have the bioeconomy without biodiversity. But increasingly in the modern society, bioeconomy is also needed to protect biodiversity. For example, for the forest managers to be able to invest in management measures that will help climate mitigation and biodiversity. So I think there are a lot of synergies which the Green Deal could be much more explicit. For example, helping to plant mixed forests. And we need the bioeconomy to generate income for managing our forests. So if I conclude with a key message, Green Deal goals on climate neutrality and resource efficiency cannot be met without a new range of bio-based solutions. And the bioeconomy is now the missing link to achieve that. I'm very positive that in the coming updating of the Green Deal and the forest strategy and biodiversity strategy, this will be understood. EU forest-based sector can do much more in creating synergies and address climate, biodiversity, economic and social issues than it does now. And I think the COVID post situation is indeed emphasizing the need of combining the different policy targets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauri Hetemäki. Very, very insightful and inspiring presentation indeed. We only have one question. We only have time for one question, but it's quite an interesting one as well. You conclude that the EU forest-based sector can do much more to create synergies between climate mitigation, biodiversity, and economic and social objectives than Green Deal now indicates. What do you mean by this, and what concrete policy measures Green Deal should have to do this?
Okay, thank you. If you think that recovery fund that will now be out there, I think it is important to spend the money that comes to forest sector in a clever way. So for example, currently in some places we still have forest management measures, for example, of clear cutting in peatlands or drainage in peatlands that are very sensitive for this, and these measures could lead to losing of carbon mitigation potential and loss of many other important factors. So the recovery fund should not go to that type of measures that have also negative side impacts. Rather, put the recovery funding to forest management measures that have a lot of synergies, like the big issue of, for example, transferring spruce monoculture forest to mixed forest. It will not be an easy task, and it will need also public funding to be able to do that. And I think that could be a good thing where you can actually combine biodiversity, climate mitigation, and bioeconomy impacts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, now it's time to move on to our panel discussion today. And the theme headline for that is Strengthening Forest-Based Sectors' Contribution to Green Deal. And the panel discussion will be moderated by Anne Toppinen from the University of Helsinki. She'll also be introducing our distinguished panelists here today. Anne Toppinen is Professor of Forest Economics and Business at University of Helsinki, and she's one of the leading forest economists in Europe. Her expertise focuses on corporate sustainability and bio-based and circular businesses, as well as related market analysis and development of sustainable business models. Our panel is in very good hands indeed. Anne Toppinen, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Marcus. I hope you can all hear me well. And greetings from Eastern Finland. I'm based here by the lakeside, so apologies if the connection somehow is not optimal, but we do our best. So we have a really fascinating 5 panelists today, but unfortunately a fairly short time, so let's get going. We have, in addition to the two professors already presenting their views, that is Jürgen Bauhus and Gert-Jan Nabuurs, we will have 3 additional viewpoints. And let's start with the first one. So I have a pleasure to introduce Fanny-Pomme Langue, coming from a Confederation of European Forest Owners. So can you, Fanny, perhaps start setting up your screen while I introduce you to the audience? So Fanny has a background in EU policies and agricultural law, and she is currently Secretary General of the European Forest Owner umbrella organization, where she joined 2018. And before that, she worked several years as a policy director in European Association called Bioenergy Europe, and many other important positions as well. So please, Fanny, the screen is yours.
So thank you very much for the invitation to participate to this event and this panel. And within my 1 slide and 5 minutes contribution to this discussion, I have chosen a few messages related to forest contribution to Green Deal. Of course, it's not exhaustive, and I would be happy to continue the discussion further during the Q&A session. So I have chosen 4 messages that I would like to share with you. The first one is a kind of horizontal message. You see these pictures of people on the slide, on the upper part of the slide, and it's called Who is Behind Forests? We talk a lot in the EU Green Deal about for what forest can do, what forest can deliver, forest benefits, but we do not talk much about who is behind the forest owners and forest managers who are actually taking the responsibility of managing their forests. As far as the private forest owners that CPF represents are concerned, it was mentioned earlier on, there are 16 million forest owners managing 60% of EU forest land, and 2/3 of forest holdings have less than 3 hectares. And the objective of all the forest owners in Europe is to manage their forest in a sustainable way and to make the best out of it and to find the right balance between the 3 main functions of forests. So this human dimension, according to me, is a bit missing when we read the Green Deal or forest-related policies. And we hope that this will be considered seriously for the implementation of the Green Deal, because ultimately the ones who are implementing the policies are the ones that you see on your screen. The second message, and it's very timely because we are now expecting, I think within like an hour, maybe less, the publication of the new EU Biodiversity Strategy to 2030. And I put this question on the screen is, are more restrictions the best way to preserve biodiversity? And that was kind of addressed already in the previous presentation. And here I would like to comment this discussion that we had over the last weeks and that will probably be in the strategy about strict protection of a certain percentage of land. In our views, this approach is risky. It's risky given the situation in which our forests are in terms of climate change impacts. Strictly protecting forests may not be the best way to make them healthier and more resilient. It's risky as well because then it would create additional burden on forest owners and managers who would own or manage these forests, which would be strictly protected. And then it would hamper the delivery of the other benefits that the society expects from forests, including biodiversity, but not only. So instead of this segregative approach, it was mentioned static approach, we are in favor of an active and adapted sustainable forest management, possibly accompanied with financial instruments when needed. But the principle of SFM and forest needs to be managed to enhance biodiversity. Then the third message is about climate change mitigation. I think a lot has been said already. And you see the question that I put on the screen is one S more important than other 2. The forest contribution to climate change mitigations, we at least in CPF, we keep repeating these 3 S. It's carbon sink, it's sequestration of carbon within wood products, and it's substitution of fossil-based materials and energy. And we have the feeling when reading at the Green Deal, and it was addressed in earlier presentations as well, that maybe there is a bit of more focus right now given to the first S, sink, compared to substitution and sequestration. And we think that all these 3 S needs to be addressed in a balanced way, and bioeconomy developments needs to be highlighted and better addressed with the implementation of the Green Deal. I think we all agree with, no one would disagree with the 2050 carbon neutrality goal. The question is how we will reach this goal. And to reach this goal, we need to substitute fossil-based material and energy. So the 3S have to be balanced. My last message is a diagram, as you can see, and I will repeat somehow what has been said earlier on. So to us, the basics and the roots for any action in forest is sustainable forest management definition and principles. Of course, forest owners and managers today, they are facing a big challenge in climate change impacts on their forest, and they are now making a lot of efforts to adapt these managements the best way to make the forest healthy and resilient. And thanks to this sustainable forest management, active and adaptive, the forest will be able to deliver all ecosystem services that the society expects from the forests, including biodiversity and climate change that you can see on the screen. And you see that I have just put an arrow between the two because I fully agree with the previous presentation to say that biodiversity and climate change mitigation are actually married. Forests cannot play their role to mitigate climate change with these 3S if they are not healthy, resilient, and if biodiversity is not enhanced. And on the other side, we cannot have healthy forest, resilient forest, and biodiversity maintained and enhanced if we don't address climate change, if we don't stop or limit these impacts of climate change on EU forests. And so having said that, we really hope that the next steps for the Green Deal implementation, we have today the biodiversity strategy, then we will have the forest strategy. And we really hope that it will be a strong standalone document making the link between all these challenges and all these benefits that forest can deliver in a holistic way. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Fanny, for your really interesting viewpoints. And the concept here is as follows. So all of the 4 other panelists are now given an opportunity to reflect very briefly on Fanny's presentation. And if you there in the audience also have comments or questions, please put those in the question and answer box. We cannot blend them in here during the panel discussion, but those will be taken into account after the panel formally ends in the Q&A session. So I'd like to then move on next to Stefan to give you a quick reflection on the previous presentation. Please, Stefan.
Thank you. And shortly, very shortly, the reflections. I think many good points highlighted on those four points. Let's remember that there is clearly people who are owning these forests, and they also need incentives to manage these forests. They take big responsibility, but they also need to have a chance to sort of manage those, and therefore that's a very valid point. I can also sort of take with me and agree on the fact that these restrictions are really the only way to preserve biodiversity. And in a way, I could add my sort of overall comment here that we need to be able to combine the different roles of the forests, and we need to be able to combine all 3 elements of sustainable development when we approach the forests and sort of combine these things. I think this is something I'd like to highlight at this stage before I have my own points soon.
Thank you, Stefan. Next, Chantal van Ham, please give your viewpoint on the forest owner perspective presentation.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you, Fanny, for this presentation. And I think, yeah, the point on finding the balance is essential here. And I think also this connection that the forest owners have to their local communities and how important it is that they also show these values that nature have in so many ways, which, yeah, is not always visible in our economic and our social systems. So as was mentioned as well before, I think it's really essential that the owners of forest and land do get a reward for the services that forests provide, and that is also not in place currently in our public financing mechanisms, but also in our private financing streams. And I think there is an opportunity, if we find the new innovative systems for climate finance, to find their way as well to forests, and in that way protect also the natural diversity of those forests for the future.
Okay, thank you. Active management, multifunctionality, finance, those seem to be the kind of keywords so far. How about next, Jürgen? Could you please reflect shortly on the previous presentation?
Yeah, I think I've made that point already in my presentation, that I think that, you know, if we really want to conserve biodiversity, but also provide all the other ecosystem functions across the European forest landscape, this is not possible without the forest owners, full stop. And on the one side, yes, we need incentives for them to provide public services, public goods. But I think we must also be aware that there are actually a lot of people who we will not reach with financial incentives. A lot of people who are withdrawing from forest management, you know, who live far away from the 2 hectares that they own somewhere. And we also need solutions for this. We need to, you know, have good systems to get in touch with these inactive or dormant forest owners, to enthuse them, you know, to revitalize their interest in managing forests. As I've mentioned, you know, we cannot afford to basically have a forest that no one looks after. You know, imagine an outbreak of an infectious disease, yeah? Or a disease or a pest species that, you know, developed in a patch of forest. No one looks at that, and then it's too late. So we need to have also this population of forest owners in mind, in addition to the point I've made previously.
Okay, thank you, Jürgen. Then last but not least, Gert-Jan, what's your intake on this?
Yeah. Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Fanny, for highlighting the role of the forest owners. And I think you nicely highlighted that we actually have a rich biodiversity within the forest owners themselves. And that is an asset too, and that's the huge variety of measures that people are taking and forest owners are taking, and a huge variety in which they will respond to drivers and incentives. And that is also a rich asset. At the same time, I agree with you. When I gave an example of, for example, having 7 million hectares of strict reserve, that is an example, but locally indeed, and with the help of this rich diversity in forest owners, we can make sure that there is this variety of the way in which you employ the measures, and that is the rich asset of the forest owners. At the same time, it's many of them only have half an hectare or 1 hectare, and that gives diversity in management, but it's also a challenge to get things done in the forests. And on the one hand, we're proud of having 16 million forest owners, but it's also a big challenge, and maybe we can better collaborate and optimize the way public money is spent in their management.
Thank you all. I think this pretty much wraps up this topic, that it is important, and even a missing dimension from the Green Deal, this more human approach and the forest ownership aspect and the European level with such a high number of private owners is definitely a challenge. How to make make this group more inclusive in this part of planning and execution of the Green Deal. I don't see any follow-up questions coming from our panelists, but I see a lot coming into the Q&A. So please, panelists, also pay attention what's coming on from there. And after the panel, it's an opportunity perhaps to go back to some of those. So next, I have a pleasure to introduce Stefan Sundman, who is the Vice President for Public Affairs and Media Relations of UPM-Kymmene forest company, headquartered here in Finland. And Stefan has a background in wood technology, so he's a really man who knows about the products. And he has been, he has a long career in terms of these issues and specialist and managerial positions also at the Federation of Finnish Forest Industries. And it said here that he's a strong believer in the renewable bio-based solutions. So let's hear more about that.
Very good. Hope that you can.
Yes, we can.
See my screen now, and then I also managed to get it on full screen mode.
Stefan, sorry, you don't have it in full screen yet. We can see it.
Yes, I'll try to somehow get it like that. Hope you see it now.
Perfect.
Very good. And thank you for the opportunity to participate in this discussion on the Green Deal and our bio-based sector. Of course, I come from a forest-based industry company now with of interests to create an economy around the forests, and therefore I have a few points on this situation and also on the Green Deal. My first point relates to the fact that we believe that sustainability is the only solid foundation for long-term value creation, and that in practice megatrends are challenging the current economic model. And here, circularity and bioeconomy combined offers several opportunities to reach the targets of Green Deal. Of course, the main target of Green Deal is climate neutrality, but if it's supposed to also be a growth program, there needs to be the economic angle to it. We believe that development will change consumer preferences. It will also change business practices and sort of challenge the current economic model. And there is a system for change to leave the sort of fossil era behind and enter something which is era beyond fossils. And I can very much agree with what Lauri said, that sort of the forest-based sector can do much more in creating synergies to address sort of in a holistic approach to climate, biodiversity, economy, and the social objectives of this whole package. But my sort of first question is that is the Green Deal really sort of including these points? I have to admit that I'm lacking them. My second point addresses actually the fact that bioeconomy is a value chain. It's a value chain starting from the forests, ending at the consumers, but coming also back. And what I mean with this is that, of course, there's the circularity included. So we want to have the very high rate of recovery of the fibers in the process, in the value chain, and be able to utilize the fibers as many times as possible. But this value chain needs to be sort of taken into account, and we need a holistic approach. So we should be able to sort of look on the whole package of sort of responsible operations from the forests, but also in all the sourcing, all the sort of production processes, on the consumption, and also finally then on what do sort of consumers do with the products at the end of the lifetime. And in my view, the Green Deal is not in its current form recognizing the whole value chain or in a way the wide opportunities which are included in this value chain, but rather approaching it from a quite narrow angle on issues like carbon storing or land use, and in a way forgetting then the sort of overall package of relating to the big challenge we have. So we have sort of unemployment, we have the challenge with the economies, and we have these big ecological challenges when it comes to climate change mitigation or also biodiversity. But as already said earlier, I think we can sort of easily find a synergy to combine these, and that's in a way what UPM here also represents, because that's exactly the way we are operating. My third point is related to sustainable forestry, which in all of its meaning means that we have to look on these things in a balance. We need to sort of be able to, it was actually Jürgen who mentioned that we need to overcome the conflict between biodiversity, economy, or why not actually also the climate. And it's a joint challenge how we are able to combine these, but definitely I believe that we are able to combine this. Responsible companies are doing it every day in their operations, and for example, we want to ensure biodiversity. We have had a biodiversity program within the company for already 20 years where we give clear operational guidance to daily operations, but we cooperate very much also with different stakeholders, whether they are researchers or NGOs, on what we can do to increase the biodiversity, to preserve the biodiversity. And we also ensure that we are planting new forests, we are sort of maintaining the forests, but all the time sort of our aim is to create more forests than we harvest. My fourth point, and actually maybe a final point here, is the fact that the world is changing. We are, of course, as said already, a market-based company, and we are operating on the markets. We are a global company with I have 19,000 colleagues all over the world working in this company with forest-based industries. And of course, from sort of the request to policies is that we need stability, we need long-term predictability, and we are ready to take our share and responsibility for the sort of operations we have. But currently, I feel that forestry and forest-based industry is approached within EU from many different angles, whether it's then sustainability criteria of forestry, or whether it's criteria for renewable energy, or green finance, or biodiversity, which is very topical today. But I think we would need an overarching or a holistic approach to this also. And here the bioeconomy strategy, which has been mentioned today, has a crucial role, because there all these different aspects or elements have been included and jointly combined. And maybe finally, I don't need to go through the sort of UPM commitment to climate change mitigation, which is there on the bottom of my slides. That's just to show that we are working on these issues all over the value chain and committed to the 1.5 degree agenda. But my final remark would be a question that, can we really reach a growth strategy if we are approaching things through restrictions or bans or limitations, rather than having encouragement, innovations, investments as the target? Because through those we can for sure find a balanced ways for all the three angles of sustainable development. Thank you.
Okay, Thank you, Stefan. And it seems to be really in Europe the kind of $1 million question how to combine the carbon goals, climate neutrality, and the growth strategy, and what are the next steps in order to start the work. So next we will hear reflections first from Fanny, and then Chantal, then Jürgen, and finally Gert-Jan. So please, Fanny, can you provide yours?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this presentation. And I think I have mentioned that in sorry, in my slide, that the point is indeed to make bioeconomy a bit higher on the agenda and to balance these 3 S, as I'm calling them, and to, of course, continue to encourage the wood-based industry into this bioeconomy way in strong partnership with the suppliers. And then just to jump on the relation between this bioeconomy and the other benefits that forest can provide, maybe if I allow myself to just jump on a question that I see on the chat so I can react and together answer to a question from Luc Bass. Will the forest sectors and owners support the biodiversity strategy? We need to read the final strategy that will be published. But I would say that we unfortunately think that this link between the different functions of forests has been missing in the discussion, at least. We need to make it all work together. So, of course, we will see the final version, and what definitely we want to be as forest owners is to be a part of the implementation of this strategy and make sure that that the forest owners will play a role in the strategy. So thank you. Okay, Chantal, what's your intake in the presentation by Stefan?
Thanks, Stefan. Yes, very important points you make. What I wanted to highlight is indeed this idea of economic growth that we have to leave behind this current model that we have at the moment, and to move to a model that is within planetary boundaries and also social equity. And yeah, we see now that what we are moving towards and want to look at with this Green Deal is an economy that serves nature and people, and yeah, that is a complete turnaround of things the way they are now. When it comes to the restrictions, as mentioned as well, I think when we talk about biodiversity, if you can call it a battle, that battle is not only fought in protected areas, but probably most of all outside these areas. If we look at agriculture, that example is incredibly clear, but I think the same counts for forest, and that is why it's so essential that the value of nature and the services that nature and forest provide are part of any sectoral policies, and that is, I think, what also the Green Deal envisions. So those are a few of my reflections on this.
Okay, thank you, Chantal. Then Jürgen.
Honestly, I don't feel the urge to reflect on this presentation, given also the shortage of time. I'll pass on to Gert-Jan.
Please, Gert-Jan, do you have urge?
Maybe very short then. Yes, Stefan, I thank you. I certainly see your point of view, and it is indeed in line with what the if we need to get rid of fossil carbon, then we will rely on renewable resources. And of course, the forest industry plays an important role in that as a mobilizer and as a part of that chain. But one of the things that has hampered within the EU is, in my mind, is that the EU and the member states have not really worked together on the topic of forests, partly because forest as such is not a competence of the EU, so there's a lot of other legislation, and that drives in different directions, sometimes competing, and that can indeed very much hamper the development of the industry and the development of a bioeconomy. So I do think that member states and the Commission need to work much more together in the future in getting all these things what we're talking about, getting that done.
All right, thank you for your comments. So we have one more presentation. So please, Chantal van Ham, can you find your slides? So Chantal is a program manager coming from International Union of Conservation Network, and you claim in your introduction that you are passionate about nature, and I can believe that. And then also you say that it's very intriguing and important to have a communication and exchange with people from different backgrounds. So I think this panel is a good example of that. And please, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting IUCN to this inspiring exchange. So I was asked to prepare one slide. That is also what you see here. And the image actually that is here was made by a photographer. His name is George Steinmetz, who has documented unique perspectives of the Earth from above with a motorized paraglider for his book, A Human Planet, but also for the New York Times, where he depicted the so-called decade in which we almost stopped climate change, an impressive series if you haven't seen it. This particular image was made in Papua, Indonesia, and yeah, these are houses which are traditionally built very high for people to be protected from mosquitoes, but also from troublesome neighbors and evil spirits. And I thought it was an interesting way of looking at this topic of the Green Deal, because zooming out and seeing the bigger picture, and as we say in Dutch, seeing the trees through the forest is important to decide on future pathways for actions. I think a lot has already been said by the presenters today, and I just wanted to capture some of the essential points that we as a global union for nature find important in moving forward, because what we've seen is that forests in Europe have really undergone great changes in the last centuries, and a lot of species have been brought to the edge of extinction. Old growth forests, as Mr. Bauhus also pointed out, are under severe pressure, and the species that rely on them are declining rapidly and deserve our priority. It is also an important day, as was said before, with today the EU Biodiversity Strategy to 2030 being presented, and EU Commissioner Sinkevičius highlighted that if we fail to act now, much of the nature we love and depend on for our food, health and economy is in danger of disappearing forever. So if we look at forest habitats in Europe, only a third is having favorable conservation status. As was mentioned before, my colleagues have presented the European Red List of trees. 42% of European tree species is also under threat. So logging and consumption of wood for fuel will increase, as well as the demands for the bioeconomy, the climate-related effects such as forest fires and storms, but also invasive alien species and pollution will cause even more pressures and a reduction of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So this European Green Deal states that all EU policies should contribute to preserving and restoring Europe's natural capital. I think this is a tremendous opportunity, but it will only lead to the desired outcomes if nature-based solutions are part and make the change in all sectoral policies, in land management, in business development and in financing. And I think there is also the aspect of making nature part of the equation in terms of valuation, because at the moment natural capital is not calculated in the same way or measured in the same way as social and economic capital is. So in order to change that, we have to, of course, implement our existing legislation, but also shift the flows of investment from the public and the private sector to those that manage and protect our natural heritage. and these are our forest and landowners. So in that respect, and I mentioned that already before, the financing for climate and biodiversity really need to be jointly developed so that the restoration and protection of forest can be part of national climate action plans in the NDCs, but also that nature-based solutions are part of risk management strategies and energy plans. So yeah, to conclude, the way how we manage our forest capital is decisive for the status of biodiversity and ecosystems and the provision of the services and products for the future. And yeah, in order to ensure there is no loss of biodiversity, we need to create these regenerative business models that conserve what exists, restore what is possible. We should not forget about soils, but also make sure that the financial returns are linked to the performance that is positive for nature. And that is underlined by the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, as well as the Bond Challenge, which aims to massively scale up the restoration and the functionality of forests and other ecosystems in our fight for climate change, but also for food security, water supply, and for biodiversity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chantal, for your excellent remarks and the importance of stressing the natural capital accounting and making nature part of the equation. It is crucial. Next, let's take a little bit different order of comments. So let's start from the end. So Gert-Jan, Jürgen, then Chantal, and finally Stefan. Please give your reflections. So let's start from Gert-Jan.
Yes, Chantal, thanks very much for your views. I'll only pick out one point to keep it rather short. You mentioned that these financial returns need to be looped back into the forest and changing the way finances are being steered, and that I think is a very good point. Although difficult to implement and will take a long time, but if you see now that out of the returns from your forest, very little actually is being reinvested into the forest. The total public spending, although these numbers are very uncertain, and that even in its core is highly remarkable, that the total public spending is roughly 7 billion per year on the European forests, and that's very little per hectare per year. And where that goes, how effective that is, and on which measures, that's very uncertain, unclear. Although maybe at some national levels there may be very good information, but within the EU that's very unclear, and that's highly remarkable that such an important part of the whole financing of the sector is so unclear. So there, I think we need to invest, get much better data. And then also that helps in steering policies, in a way like Stefan mentioned earlier, in much more stable and longer term policies. Stick to that.
Okay, so financing and returns and reinvestment are key topics. How about Jürgen? What would you like to say?
Yeah, also thank you from my side, Chantal. Very important points that you're making. I would just briefly like to reinforce one point that you made. You mentioned that we need to look at nature-based solutions to develop risk management strategies. And I think we really need to upgrade our risk management strategies. In the past, a lot of that has been done sort of within the core of the forestry sector, and we see now how miserable we fail in some regards. But what we really are lacking are risk management strategies also to the provision of the whole breadth of ecosystem services. Yeah, we have no risk management strategy for provision of recreational values, for example. Yeah, we really need to move in this direction and need to look at what elements could be in this Green Deal, in the biodiversity strategy, and hopefully a strong forestry strategy that would enable that. Rest my case.
Thank you, Jürgen. Then Fanny, please.
Thank you very much, Chantal, for your points. A few comments, maybe because I think there are some common ideas between what I said and what you said. First of all, when you mentioned that we need to preserve our natural capital, I think that there is no forest owners in Europe who wants to destroy this natural capital and wants to do something bad in his or her forest. So I think that the aim is definitely shared. I have the feeling with the different contributions of this panel sometimes that we were talking as if we would have to start thinking about how to enhance biodiversity, like if it was not done already, but that's part of the daily management today of forest owners' work. So we don't start from scratch. About possible investments to solutions like to invest in protection or closer to nature or to enhance biodiversity. There are cases already, and again, we don't start from scratch. There are projects based on voluntary basis of forest owners with collaboration with stakeholders, including EU, national NGOs, with financial compensations. These kind of projects exist. You raise a point that maybe it's not enough developed, so we could build on that, provided that we remain in this voluntary approach with financial compensations. I think the ultimate point is to, as it was rightly mentioned, that there are forest owners who are today not managing their forest, not because they don't want, but because it's small size and the motivation is sometimes lacking, and we need to make this management active. So the question is maybe not again to dictate a kind of management type to each and every forest owners, but to involve all forest owners into making them sustainably manage their forest, including biodiversity, of course. Thank you very much.
Okay, and finally, Stefan, your opportunity to reflect.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Chantal. I'll try to make it very shortly. I think you mentioned things sort of which are we know the challenges, and I definitely believe that the way out is that we are able to combine and find a balanced way of if we talk about investments into nature, or we talk about investments overall, we always need a payback for an investment, and therefore we need to find a balance so that there is an incentive for the forest owner to do these things, and that clearly sort of it's based on some kind of economy also, sort of coming from the company perspective, but clearly I think we need to be able to combine the social, economical, and ecological angles here, and that's in my view the way forward too.
Okay, I think that puts a nice ending to this discussion with emphasis and reminder of the importance of all dimensions of sustainability. I don't see any follow-up questions among the 5 panelists, but there are a lot of questions coming from the audience. So I would maybe propose that you, Marcus, take the lead and go to the next phase.
Thank you very much, Anne. And thank you to all the distinguished panelists for an extremely lively and inspiring discussion and some very, very insightful remarks and reflections. And as I promised you, Toppinen was the perfect head for this panel discussion, because we're back on schedule. We were lagging behind 15 minutes, but we're back on schedule, and that's always a great thing. Thanks for that as well. The next thing that we'll be actually doing before we'll be taking the questions from the audience, because after this panel, as I promised in the beginning, it's possible to also use your own voice to present your questions by raising your hand. But before we go to that, we have another poll question for you, which will be launched right now. And we'll actually be taking a look at the poll that we did in the very beginning of this webinar together to kind of see what kind of developments might have happened in your minds during this time. So, should forest bioeconomy be included in Green Deal proposal more than it is now? Keep it as it is. Yes, update it, and do not know. Okay, we have a quick result, and obviously the result, or the interesting part of this result, is to see what's happened to the question of, or to the answer of do not know. And in the first time when we asked this about 2 hours ago, the do not know answers were 15%. Now they're only 9%. So it's been very beneficial to be participating in this webinar. That's a good takeaway from this. And yes answers have now risen to 89% from the original, was it 70 something? Good. And let's now take the second poll. And our next question is in a way also a kind of a follow-up question to the one that we asked in the beginning. And it was about choosing only one role for the EU forest-based sector in the European Green Deal. But here in the poll number 4, we ask, do you think there are mainly synergies or trade-offs between increasing forestings to mitigate climate change, protection of biodiversity, and forest bioeconomy mitigating climate change? And we have 3 different alternatives, and I do not know there as well. A couple of more moments, and we'll get the final result here. And it looks like mainly trade-offs is 15%. 21 people out of all of you thought that it's only about trade-offs. Mainly synergies, 28%, and as much trade-offs as synergies of 47%. Almost half of you believe it's as much trade-offs as there is synergies, and 9% are not sure or do not know. Do any of the panelists or other of the speakers here today want to reflect or make their comments on these results?
If I can do just a short comment. The second one, I think it's logical and obvious, and it's for me also the most accurate. But the first one, when it comes how it's included in the Green Deal, the real question is how we understand Green Deal. Because if we understand the Green Deal as a document which was published in December, then we are simply misunderstanding everything. That was a kind of a shell to which then other contributions started to add. So I think it's pretty essential that we understand it in that way, which also means that our seminar, our webinar today, it's not too late, and that we can still contribute, because if we would understood it in a way that the Green Deal is ended with the contribution which was done in December, and if we would understand it in a narrow way, then the things which we are doing does not make a lot of sense.
Good comment. Any other comments at this point? Okay, then let's move to the part where the audience gets to make the questions from the panelists or any of the speakers here today. And as I mentioned before, you can raise your hand, and I'll give you the permission to speak out loud through your microphone if you wish to do so. I don't see any raised hands here yet, so let's take a look at the Q&A section and look at some questions from there. A question number 1, no speaker addressed the question of imported deforestation. It is mentioned in the Green Deal, but measures to combat it are rather vague. How can this issue be taken up in the bioeconomy concept? Does anyone want to address this? The question of imported deforestation. Lauri.
Thank you, Marcus. In my presentation, I showed the slide where there was a share of forest in EU, Brazil, and Russia. And we know that in Brazil especially, we have issues related to deforestation. And one point that I wanted to make with the slide also, which I didn't mention, is that when in the Green Deal or the update of a Green Deal, we are discussing of the measures that EU can do for the climate neutrality 2050. It is really important that we address the forest problems, the deforestation, degradation, also outside EU. I think it would be natural for European Union to cooperate, especially with the neighboring countries, Russia and Africa. Africa has also 16% of the world forests. And I think EU in the Green Deal could also do much for Africa and the forest sector in Africa and to help also the climate mitigation. So I think this is a very good question, very relevant, and we need to address it even more in the future. Thank you.
That was a good answer. Then there was a question to Fanny-Pomme Langue. How will you and others motivate and mobilize the millions of forest owners who are not currently active?
Thank you. That's not an easy question.
Questions.
I think, well, first of all, I think it's important to remind that this question is not, doesn't sound the same depending on which member states we are talking to. So there are member states which are facing more this challenge to mobilize forest owners than others. I think, well, first of all, maybe first identify these forest owners and convince them that it makes sense to work together in order to streamline their actions and possible managing decisions. Because if you have less than an hectare, then of course it makes sense maybe to talk to your neighbors to see how these decisions, how you could plan things together. So this kind of encouraging forest owners together, it's one measure today in the Common Agricultural Policy, and we hope it will remain. Another aspect which I think is very important to encourage forest owners to actually manage their forest is actually information and training. Because most of the forest owners, they don't live from their forests. They do it as they manage it as a passion, or they inherited it. It's something that they want to keep and transmit, but they may not know about like forestry and how. So to motivate them to manage their forests, I think the advisory services and training is also very important to also make them understand how to manage a forest and all this holistic approach that we have been discussing during this event. So there are two things that I could highlight, for example. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that answered the question. There's one question regarding the EU biodiversity strategy, which is just coming out in the next couple of minutes, I guess. The question is, will the forest sector support the EU biodiversity strategy that will be released? Can anyone give an idea of that?
I can start. I tried to answer somehow. Again, we will need to read the final paper. I think it's difficult to say support or not support. The question is, in our views, as far as we have seen or heard, this kind of holistic approach is still missing, or was still missing. I have commented as well the strict protection measure and the views of forest owners on that. Having said that, of course, this strategy is important. I think from our side, we will support the goals, the ultimate goals. And we want to be a key player for implementing this strategy in a way, because again, as I try to explain, if we don't take into account the human dimension, then each and every policy, whether national or EU-based, cannot be a success. So we want to play a role in the implementation, and of course it's a strategy. So it's the it's the beginning of the discussion on the future targets and measures. So I hope this answers to the questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'll take one more question from here before we move on to our last poll. The idea of incentives was mentioned several times today. Does this refer to financial incentives? And if so, where should this come from? Can anybody give light on this? Stefan.
Well, at least I use the word in my speech and in my points. When I talk about an incentive, sure, it might be an economical incentive or a financial incentive, but I'm not referring to any public incentives, rather to market-based incentives, which in my view is part of the commercial forestry we have today, where the income for the forest owner to take care of his or her forest and manage that is coming from the fact that sort of through sustainable forest management, you also harvest and you get an income for the wood you sell to our value chain, where we then produce products out of it and replace fossil consumption in the world with sort of a large scale of current products and sort of new products to different sectors. But the way I use the word incentive is not referring to a request to have more public funding, because in the end of the day, all funding in this world is coming from us consumers through the companies, and the public side is limited in the income to have the income from the private sector.
Very good. Thank you very much. Now we'll go to the final poll today, and the poll reads out loud: should the COVID-19 impacts to society and economy result to changes to the EU Green Deal proposal? The question couldn't be more topical than this. Okay, I think we have the final results here. So about 24% say no, keep it as it is. And the vast majority, 72%, say yes, update it to put more emphasis in linking its objectives to economic recovery and employment. And only 4% say yes, forget it, and come up with a totally new proposal. Thank you very much. Any comments from the panelists or from the speakers to this poll? No comments. Very good. Thank you for taking part in these polls to the audience members, and now we're at the stage where we'll be taking the concluding remarks by the ThinkForest president Janez Potočnik. Thanks for all the excellent questions and for all the knowledgeable and insightful answers that we've heard here today. So, Janez, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Dear friends, I hope you have found the webinar is interesting as I did. First, two short clarifications I think are needed. The first one, if we understand the European Green Deal in the broadest sense I have explained before, some of the questions starting, does the European Green Deal deliver that and that, does simply not have yet the answer. Some are coming on the table in a few minutes with a farm to fork and biodiversity strategy. And the second, I do agree that member states and European Commission should be working more together when it comes to forestry. But since I have spent some life in the European Commission, I could add, you do not need to convince European Commission about that. But in closing, I will not focus much on what you have heard during the webinar, even if some messages are clearly worth repeating. I will rather provide, try to provide a convincing answer on currently most critical and also most frequently asked question. By the way, I didn't know what will be the last question which you will ask, Marcus, but it's actually an answer to that question. And again, I was a bit surprised in in the call for renewing the Green Deal, if you understand it in a way I have tried to explain it. But I will try to explain probably the most important issue which is today on the table, because it is more about will the Green Deal survive, or will it be a recovery package which will be remaining the real drive of our future activities, which will be distant from the European Green Deal. So why the European Green Deal and the post-COVID-19 recovery are for me the two sides of the same coin. 5 points. The first one, the economic policy designed by the European Green Deal and related documents are the most convincing competitiveness policy for the European Union. Why? For most of the critical resources, Europe is import dependent. Prices of resources in the long term are increasing. In short term, at least they are volatile. The share of material costs in the overall cost in industry is increasing. Social considerations, social security are among core values in Europe, and we should protect and prevent that they will be deteriorated. All that, I think, is quite clearly recognized also by recent European Commission documents. But in short, better management of natural resources is vital for maintaining and improving European Union competitiveness, and also for strengthening our autonomy. It was important before the COVID-19 crisis. It will be essential after. So implementing the European Green Deal and all other related implementation documents is the best way to strategically strengthen our preparedness and resilience. Circular bioeconomy is the best way to manage and lower European Union resource dependency, improve our competitiveness, and lower our environmental and climate impacts and provide opportunities for new local jobs. Second argument, European Green Deal already provides convincing answers to some COVID-19 concerns related to reconsidering globalization effects. After the COVID-19, it will be impossible to avoid the question of reconsidering the effects of globalization. Remember, French President Macron, for example, said the coronavirus will change the nature of globalization with which we have lived for the past 40 years. But this question should, of course, be approached carefully with all potential effects and responsibility in mind. Many of the globalization effects have introduced positive developments, which do also result in the improved quality of life, also in least developed countries. Anyway, many are today mentioning the need for decreasing dependency, increasing self-sufficiency, strengthening economic resilience. My point is that already by implementing circular bioeconomy, in practice means decreasing dependency of European industry on huge material and energy imports, and introducing opportunities for new jobs, which are, through the very nature of circularity, through maintaining various natural resources longer in production and consumption processes, more local than in the case of current economic model. Forests and wood as a natural and local material, climate smart forestry, as mentioned by Gert-Jan, could play an important role in this respect. Third, both European Green Deal and post-COVID-19 call for an intergenerational solidarity and agreement. One of the main reasons for the necessity of the European Green Deal is certainly the fact that we are indebting future generations through depletion of natural capital. And one of the facts related to the COVID-19 crisis is that it is more affecting older than younger generation. To protect the more endangered lives of the older generation, the younger generation is showing high level of intergenerational solidarity. But to solve the economic effects of the crisis, many countries and institutions have already announced to put on the table billions of euros and dollars. This, of course, means additional indebtedness, which will fall also on the shoulders of the young generation, as we have heard before clearly, who will at the end pay the bill. In both cases, conclusion for me, it's clear. we cannot leave the young generation with all the debts, financial and environmental, without providing them with a promise and a solution of a better world than the one we are currently providing them. So we need an intergenerational agreement with a clear promise of a more sustainable and resilient world. Fourth, COVID-19 is providing the necessary missing urgency to the European Green Deal and climate-related financial efforts. COVID-19 and financial consequences of economic lockdown are obviously considered as urgent. But the COVID-19 reaction is also clearly revealing that while accepting the need to fight against climate change biodiversity loss, we have never considered it really urgent. The amount of financial support deployed or promised today, it's incomparable with any efforts related to greening of the economy and tackling the climate change. This is paradoxically offering a major opportunity for massive changes to the economy. The time and opportunity for a real change is now. In the climate arena, we have been seeking trillion-dollar action for decades, and now with the COVID response, we have the right scale and countries are prepared to move immediately. The key will be to direct those funds in the best way to both address the recovery and to address our need for a global climate action. The opportunity which lies in this fact is unique. If financial support is used in the European Green Deal consistent way, it could provide an important element to the missing urgency when it comes to fighting the climate change and biodiversity loss. And finally, both COVID-19 and European Green Deal related challenges require new approaches to the governance, in particular on the global level. Challenges of a global nature can only be efficiently addressed by joining the forces and by cooperating. Remember, we are for the first time facing the emergence of a single, tightly coupled human socio-ecological system of planetary scope. We are more vulnerable and fragile, more interconnected and interdependent than ever. This clearly calls for more sharing of sovereignty and more cooperation, like we are, for example, already seeing in the case of Paris Climate Agreement. Also, global actions to join forces in finding the cure and vaccine in the case of COVID-19, it's a clear example how we are able to act and cooperate when we see something necessary. Due to the changing and challenging world, this increased cooperation and coordination needs to become a norm and not an exception. Dennis Meadows, one of the scientists behind the Club of Rome call published in The Limits of Growth, recently released a very interesting article addressing relations among efficiency, actually intensification of production, and resilience. I'm quoting, "The incentive to raise efficiency has been spurred by the fact that those who can produce and sell the same output with less input generally make greater profits. As a result, over the past century, there has been wholesale abandonment of resilient systems in favor of efficient systems, larger scale, less diversity, lower redundancy. Many have profited by optimizing the health systems to be extremely efficient in its use of inputs. Now we are all paying the cost for the resultant loss of resilience. Slowing growth in population and in consumption of materials and energy will not eliminate the problem, but it would reduce the pressure to increase efficiency, intensification, and leave more possibility for increasing resilience." And what do we need to keep in mind to create conditions for effective synchronized post-COVID-19 and European Green Deal approach? The health effects, as well as the economic effects following the measures to address these health effects in the European Union, will be asymmetrical for countries and also for economic sectors. Without a strong solidarity, we risk the emergence of a dangerous extremism, of questioning of the values of European Union, and even of the future existence of the European Union. While nobody is denying the importance of urgency of delivering this necessary help, it is also essential that it's provided with an European Green Deal system thinking in mind and not following the traditional silos sectoral logic. For example, helping only car industry without taking into consideration the whole investment needs to shift the entire mobility system to a more sustainable one, to improve the utility of the cars, to create alternative public transport systems and needed infrastructure could easily lead to just another future lock-in, which of course will be again difficult to manage. It is a very serious trap of using an established traditional sectoral approach one can easily fall in. Finally, coming quickly back to our forest-related topics. I do agree with Lauri that EU forest-based sector can do much more in creating synergies to address holistically climate, biodiversity, economic and social objectives than European Green Deal proposal now indicates. That the circular bioeconomy is an important element in post-COVID-19 recovery strategy since it helps to combine climate and economic needs. I would add also the biodiversity. I also agree with Jürgen that increasing the coverage of strictly protected areas, while certainly being useful, is unlikely to do the trick of efficient biodiversity protection, and that biodiversity hotspots needs to be better connected, protected, and restored. Increase adaptive capacity and restore biodiversity and ecosystem functioning of all forests would certainly help. Renewable resources, sustainable circular bioeconomy, and forest potential in particular are an important answer to the question why the policy response to the post-COVID-19 would need to be strategically the same as proposed by the European Green Deal. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, as I have underlined in my opening, it is more or less on us to help make it real. There is no reasonable alternative to changing the way we produce and consume, and to make our economy and society sustainable and more resilient, also if we want to be successful in our fight against climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. I sincerely hope the lesson we are living through currently, it's convincing enough, and we will not need another one to finally act. Also when it comes to protecting our nature, our natural resources, our ecosystems, our very conditions for the existence. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have found it useful. I will not end up like usually on the conferences wishing you a safe way back home, but rather take care, stay healthy, and hope to see you soon again in person.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janez, for your concluding remarks and your critically topical, important insights and points. And thank you to all the distinguished speakers and panelists here today. And most of all, thank you to all of you in your kitchens and living rooms and home offices around Europe for being so active, being so interested in the topic, and for joining us here today for this webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, until the next time, stay healthy and safe. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.